Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Justin Contanicola. I am the Young Adult Librarian at the Ridgewood Public Library. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Stephen Rossner, founder of SAT-ACT Sense, and he will be presenting information about taking the SAT-ACT in the post-pandemic era. So Stephen was a former high school English teacher for 10 years and has had his business now for 15 and spent 25 years in the public and private education. So this program is designed to walk parents and teens through this standardized testing process to determine whether or not you should be preparing for these exams at all. So please note that this program is being recorded. It will be emailed to everybody once we have uploaded it and edited and done all that fun stuff. There will be a portion at the end for Q&A. So thank you again for joining us, everybody. And I turn it over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. And as Justin said, my name's Steve Rossner. I own and run a test prep company called SAT-ACT Sense. I have 25 years, my background in education. I started out as a high school English teacher and loved the job. Just a lot of bureaucracy and red tape along the way kind of drifted me away from there. You know, the kids were great to work with, but as the years went on, the administrative part of the job became more than the teaching part. And we saw a lot of dumbing down in public education during my time about in that early 21st century, and it was disturbing. I taught English, and the curriculum that wanted to be taught was a little different than what I wanted to teach and prepare kids eventually for taking these types of exams, these standardized exams, whether that's working on vocabulary, grammar, reading comp, inference skills, and these weren't the skills that were on the curriculum. So I decided at that point then it was time to leave teaching. And I went on then to work for a couple of test prep companies, Princeton Review and Kaplan. And working for those companies made me realize how much I needed to work for myself. And eventually I got my own business and became entrepreneurial with it, took my teaching skills and started my own business. And now I've been in the business for over almost 15 years, so 25 years total in education. And I want to welcome you for the topic tonight, which is about taking the SAT and ACT in the post-pandemic era. And that's what our discussion is going to be. So I get a lot of calls now, especially and emails from parents, counselors, even from schools asking me questions about what this test optional means. And what do I do if I want my son possibly to apply a very high-end school like a Stanford, any sort of business school, whether it's one of the Ivies, Cornell. I mean, all these schools now, we know the Ivies, they're all test optional pretty much. And a lot of schools are becoming more and more test optional. So what do we do when we're in a situation where we don't know how to go about this process, whether or not we should even take these SAT or ACTs based on what this test optional means? So for example, if we're applying to a school that is asking for a minimum of 1,500, let's say, whatever school that may be, Ivy League, Stanford, and it's optional. And we decide, you know what, how do we determine if I should take this test, let alone even prepare for it? So the best place to start, as I tell all parents when we're preparing, is to do a diagnostic test for both the SAT and ACT. And it kind of gives you an idea of where you're starting off at, and to do this in a stimulated way where it's proctored, whether we have extended time, time and a half, double time, but that's the first step. And for example, if we take this diagnostic SAT test under simulated conditions, and let's say we score a hypothetical of an 1120, and we're trying to get into a school where the low bar is 1,500, at that point, it is not worth to prepare for that exam, knowing where you're at and where you need to get to on the low end. So let's take another example. Let's say we need minimum 1,300 and we start off at an 1,120. In that situation, the investment, the resources, the time is worth it to attempt to try to get to that number versus where you're almost 400 points away from your target. So where would I start with this process? Step one, what schools am I applying to? Are they test optional or are they not? MIT, not test optional. Other schools are test optional. Bard, Babson, I mean, you can go online and you can put in what schools are test optional and you'll see the list. So the first step is, am I applying to schools that are test optional, or am I applying to schools where I have to take this test? And then from there, you would devise your game plan. So once we've decided, you know what, I'm applying to schools that are test optional, that doesn't mean I shouldn't take the test. Where you start is to get the baseline to determine whether or not it's worth to prepare for the exam. That's the next step. So in order, just to keep reviewing, because I like to review, step one, find out schools that I'm specifically applying to. Are they test optional or are they optional? And from that point, then I'm going to go to step two. Step two, okay, they are test optional. They're not. Either way, I would still take those diagnostic tests to get a barometer, a gauge, a yardstick of where your scores are coming in at. And then from there, you can devise a game plan. One, should I take the SAT? Or two, should I take the ACT? And the myth about the difference between those two tests, whether you live on the West Coast, whether you live in the Midwest, whether you live on the Northeast, basically in the 60s, 70s, from 1950s to 70s, the SAT was the test that everybody took in the Northeast, and the ACT was the test you took in the Midwest because it was based out of Iowa. But today, the playing field has changed where every school will accept ACT, SAT from Hofstra to Harvard. It doesn't matter. They'll take either test. So when you're at that point of determining where do I go, we then would decide, all right, this is the game plan. And then after we decide which test, whether it be SAT or ACT, we can then customize it more. And there's a difference between these two tests. What I've seen and how these tests have changed now after the pandemic, and I have seen differences in these tests because obviously I live and breathe the test. I see the test. That's all I do. I tutor, I teach, I look at anytime we get a new test, because the ACT releases the tests 3 times during the year. So we get to see actual official tests. And again, once you get that baseline test, you can kind of match your skill set for the test. So what I don't see a lot in today's generation are students who are readers, who have a passion and love for reading. I'm not going to go into the reasons why that's the case, but as a result of that, the reading is usually, generally, for most students, the most challenging part of those tests, especially on the SAT, because the reading passages are denser. One of the passages actually has a historical double passage where they're going to take an excerpt from some sort of historical document, whether it be Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, whether it be an Edmund Burke essay. It's going to be an actual document, and it's going to be historical, and they're going to compare and contrast those two in that original language. And you are not going to see that type of passage on the ACT. The difference is the ACT is more of a test of timing, trying to beat the clock. Questions are much more direct on the reading. So if I'm Johnny and I'm a fast test taker, ACT usually the better way to go. But again, the reading is so fast, it's 40 questions in 35 minutes. But there's a way to prepare for that, more so, I feel, than to try to prepare for the SAT reading passages, because those passages are extremely more challenging, in my opinion, than the ACT. And I'm not minimizing the ACT reading or watering that down. I just say the game plan for the ACT reading, I feel, will bring you more quantifiable results than the SAT. I think it's easier to move the ACT verbal than it is the SAT verbal, hands down, and even with or without test accommodations. Again, have I tutored both tests? Do I like both tests? Yes, but on the verbal end, I feel there's a distinct advantage on the ACT, especially if you have test accommodations. Now, conversely, the math on the ACT has become extremely difficult over the past 10 years. And you can see how difficult it is when the curve is just generous to get that 35, 36 score. But ACT math compared to the SAT math, hands down, is more challenging. And there is an SAT calculator section, and there's a no calculator section on that test. On the ACT, the math is all calculator. It's 60 minutes. Excuse me 1 second, I need some water. So it's 60 minutes for 60 questions. And again, it's a fast-paced test. So a lot of students get intimidated with the timing and the pacing. But the trade-off is the SAT gives you more time, as we said, but especially on the reading, the passages are denser, they're more challenging. It's 52 questions for 65 minutes. But again, there's a game plan for each of these tests preparing and teaching students how to take the test and not necessarily read all the passages first. But again, in a world where we don't read and texting is our form of discourse, these passages become a little more challenging than, say, maybe they would have been, say, 30, 40 years ago when someone else is taking the test, just because the level of reading is different. But on the math side, again, ACT, tougher, more challenging, I feel, especially the back end, those last 10, 15 questions. It could be just open waters in regard to what they test you on. With the SAT math, we have more of a sense of familiarity of what we're going to see on the last 3 or 4 questions, both calculator and no calculator sections. And if there's one section where I would say students come to us with the least amount of skill set, it would be the grammar. And again, for someone who's taught in public school, I know that probably there's no one on this call right now that has a grammar textbook. I'd be willing to place that bet. Even if you're in a private school, grammar textbooks are just, they're a dying breed. And in public school, I don't even know if they exist anymore, but when I taught, we had the Warner grammar textbook, and I loved it. I was one of the few teachers to use it, and I understand it's a little dry. But again, there's a way to incorporate grammar to make that not only educational, but fun. And what's happened, I think we've seen in the generation, I don't want to say Generation Z or millennials, but again, I'm not picking on them, but what we're not seeing is this crop of teachers coming up and learning grammar, maybe as we might have seen in those 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's not an indictment on any sort of school or education, but again, if you think about it, how many students in high school have a grammar textbook? Maybe there's a unit or chapter covered here and there, but it's not something that's reinforced. Maybe there's 1 year. I know students who attend Chaminade High School in Long Island, it's required freshman year where the boys have their iPad and they have a full year of grammar. Now that's good. That's good. It's being reinforced. Now the problem is what's going to happen second, third, fourth year. I guess it's assumed that they still know that, but at least they're getting 1 year of that. So that is the section where I see most students coming to me with the least amount of knowledge, knowing the difference between a pronoun, a verb, but a lot of these skill sets can be taught. And that's a part of a test where we want to find out, is that the area where we need the most improvement on the grammar section? And that's why we want to take a full diagnostic test for both tests, SAT, ACT, and then almost like an MRI, figure out what we're going to do to plan that, how we're going to go about and prepare for those exams, either or. So let's go through the steps again. Step one, do I need to take these tests? If I do, I know it's not optional, or even if it's optional, I would still take the diagnostic tests, but I wouldn't necessarily prepare for the exams. Take the diagnostic, gives you a good barometer of where you're at, whether you should prepare for the exams or whether you're miles away. And you know what? It's not worth the time and resources. Let's just go optional, not send our scores, and we'll focus on AP exams, our grades, recommendations, essays. I understand that. That's another option to go. But remember, then you're doubling down on all of those by not sending in those test scores. In other words, those need to be of a higher caliber than even just a good SAT, ACT score. So you have to keep that in mind, what that optional factor means. Now, again, if you are in an area above what they're looking for test optional, you send those scores, you're in a huge advantage, huge. And that's why a lot of students still prepare for the exam, but they need to know whether or not they should prepare. And that's why I said to keep reiterating, to take those diagnostic tests, SAT, ACT, and then determine, do I need to even take these tests? This is where my score is at. If I'm at a 27 on the ACT, can I get to 31? It's possible, absolutely. If I'm at a 25 and I need to get to 34, that's probably not going to happen. And I would then say, don't make the investment in preparing. So again, that's where I would start. And then once you've determined that, you know what, I am going to prepare for these exams because the number that I need to get to is in striking distance of a wide range of colleges and universities that I'm applying to, whether I'm an athlete, whether I'm going ED, whether I'm going in the general population pool. So that's where I would go. And then we would customize the prep for either one of these tests. But like I said, broadly speaking, SAT reading, more challenging than ACT reading. I gave the reasons why, the historical passage, even the science, the natural science passage on the SAT is definitely more intimidating than the one on the ACT. And again, as I said before, the questions on the ACT are much more straightforward. You're going to get a lot more questions that are going to start off with the phrase, according to the passage, according to the author. And when we see that type of verbiage, we know the answer is going to be directly stated in the passage versus an SAT reading question that's going to have more imply, infer, suggest in the questions, indicating that it's a harder question. So those are some nuances between the two tests that I find fascinating. I live and study and breathe this all day. So I just take these tests and look at them and tutor. So I have the pedigree in regard to knowing what I've seen on these tests and how the tests have changed and now what's happening after the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, everybody had a tutor, right? SAT was a rite of passage, almost like reading Catcher in the Rye or To Kill a Mockingbird. But today, I don't think you need that. But if you do, that's when I would probably make the preparation, extremely customized to that point of knowing where my goals are and knowing that if I do send my SAT, ACT scores and they're above what those numbers are, I've got a bigger advantage than I did before the pandemic. So again, a lot of things to think about. Another test that's just as important, as I talked about with Justin before, are the AP exams. And that test is important because now there are no SAT-2 subject tests. So your AP exams, not only are they possibly worth college credits with 4s and 5s, but again, the rigor of the classes you're taking are going to be extremely important if we don't go down that SAT, ACT route. So you want to think about that too. So these are all factors that weigh into whether or not, one, do I want to prepare? Two, am I close to my goal? And three, if I reach that goal and surpass it, then I'm in even a better shape than I was not taking the test. So I've always told a lot of my students when I was teaching English, the art of learning not to say the words or phrases, you know, like, stuff, and this is just something side. And as you see during this presentation, I've mastered the art of not saying those words or phrases. And when I was teaching, anytime one of the students would say that, they would have to put a quarter into what we would have a fund, and we would call it the you know, like me, fund. And these were just phrases that were so dead that I was really trying to reinforce to get students not to say this. And we must have raised over $1,000 just on that alone. And this is just with quarters, dimes, and nickels over a year, and really trying to condition the kids. Same thing with conditioning in regard to grammar and vocabulary, these skill sets that need to be reinforced at an early age. And the reading, I can't impress upon the importance of that. And I'm not obviously taking away anything from math, but the reading is going to follow us everywhere, because unless we're going into the field of engineering or math, most other college courses, there's a lot of books to read and writing. So those are skill sets that are so important that obviously they've eliminated the essay too on the tests now. It's optional on one of them, but the essay was never really important. It was almost embarrassing, the essay, for some of the students. They were making them take it at the end of the test. The students were physically exhausted, and I never understood the point of the essay. But as I said, that would be the process I would go through, those steps. And again, the AP exams, they're very important too. So we don't want to, we want to take those are just as important as the SAT and ACT too. So now the next question is, when do I start? Steve, okay, how do I go about this process? The best time to start is going junior year, rising junior in the summer of junior year. So when you're heading into junior year as a rising junior, when you're making that transition from sophomore to junior, that summer to me is the ideal time to prepare for the exam. Why? One, there's no school. Two, there should be fewer school activities, sports, and just driver's ed and those other activities that will pull you away from the prep. Because when you're preparing for this, it's extremely difficult to make this a third tier priority, because when school starts, school, sports, then it would become a lower priority. So in the summer, it's more of a priority, and it's easier to work with time management too, because there are fewer responsibilities academically and socially. And again, if you're an athlete, you're not in season unless you're on a travel team, but that would be the time I would prepare for these exams. Summertime, diagnostic test, have the game plan ready. The SAT is offered in August and October. And November and December. So you have that time. I like the August, October test if I'm preparing in the summer. And the ACT is offered in July, September, and October. So we have a lot of options if we decide to prepare for the tests in the summer. But I do like the summer. Summer is a good time to prepare for the exam, especially if you're a rising junior. I'm not a fan of waiting till senior year to decide to prepare for that. I think that's too late. Sometimes students take the test even early. Athletes, sometimes they need scores sophomore year, late sophomore year. So really depends on your situation and the situation you're in. Everybody comes to me with a different situation. Some of them are high-end athletes. Some of them are trying to get into posh boarding schools. So everybody has a different target. Everybody has a different goal. But again, I think what's important is that you have a realistic understanding of whether or not you should prepare for this exam based on where your starting scores are. And I think that's the most important step. There's obviously the information you can find out easily online, which schools are test optional, which ones aren't. But as I said, the stepping stone, the process I would take is start with those diagnostic tests. They're 3.5 hours each, standard time. Typically, we take them at 9 a.m. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to speak to Justin at the end of the seminar. We can talk about that. But that's where I would start that process, those 2 tests, and then really hone in on which test is the better one. SAT, ACT, if I'm preparing, and then again, the summer, good time to prepare going into junior year and fewer responsibilities. And hopefully you can get this process over with where it doesn't drag out, where you're taking the test 3, 4, 5 times and trying to super score it over and over and over. Because in the end, there's going to be a diminishing return on the test. I usually don't recommend taking it more than 3. Ideally, I like 2. But all the schools pretty much super score the SAT and ACT. You'll see that now. But anyway, that's about 30 minutes. I hope that felt, or you got a lot out of that. I don't like PowerPoint presentations. I don't think they're helpful with something like this. I think an engaging dialogue is better, and that's what I wanted to do, especially here at the end of the presentation, to kind of open it up for some questions for the last 30 minutes. And hopefully you got a lot out of that and kind of gave everybody a game plan. Justin, you have the floor. If anybody wants to talk or has specific questions, you yourself too, please ask.
All right, thank you, Stephen. I'm gonna go ahead. Thank you again for joining everybody. I'm gonna just stop the recording so that we can just do the Q&A.
Sure.